The wealthy businessman gestured dismissively at his elderly mother and laughed. "She speaks no English," he told his associates, "just a simple Bedouin from the desert." But the waitress beside their table recognized the wounded silence beneath that black abaya. She leaned in close and spoke a dialect so ancient and poetic that the old woman's eyes filled with sudden light. What happened next would teach a son that the language he was ashamed of carried a dignity his money could never buy. Fatima was never supposed to speak. She was a 28-year-old immigrant working double shifts, a ghost in a uniform who cleared plates and avoided eye contact. But when the businessman called his mother's language worthless, the insult struck a wound she knew too well. Her own grandmother had been a Bedouin elder. Her dialect carried poetry that survived centuries of desert silence. Across the Arab world, that heritage is being lost to shame and ambition. Young men trade tradition for status, never realizing what they leave behind. Tonight, a London restaurant would become a classroom, and the teacher was someone he'd never even noticed. The restaurant was called Al-Maha, a name meant to evoke the elegance of Arabian oryxes, but its soul belonged to London's Knightsbridge. Crystal goblets caught the amber glow of candlelight as waiters glided between tables carrying silver trays of grilled lamb and saffron rice. This was where Gulf businessmen sealed deals over £100 bottles of still water, where old money from Riyadh and Dubai mingled with the new billionaires of British property empires. On any given night, the parking valets handled more Rolls-Royces than the rest of London combined. Fatima began her shift at 5 o'clock that evening, lacing her sensible black shoes in the staff changing room while her supervisor recited the night's specials. She had worked at Al-Maha for 14 months, ever since she'd left the kebab shop in Edgware Road, where the owner paid her under the table and the customers grabbed at her wrists. At least here, the uniform was crisp, the tips were generous in a silent, disdainful way, and the manager did not tolerate certain kinds of behavior from the patrons. Progress, she told herself, small steps. She had not always been a waitress. In her grandmother's village outside Tabuk, in the northwestern reaches of Saudi Arabia, she had been the clever one, the girl who memorized the old ghazals before she could read, who could recite 100 lines of desert poetry without stumbling. Her grandmother, Sultan, had been the acknowledged keeper of the tribe's oral history, a woman whose dialect was so pure that linguists from Riyadh universities had visited twice to record her speech before she died. She spoke the Arabic of pre-Islamic poetry, a language shaped by sand and scarcity, its vowels elongated like the shadows of camels at dusk. When Sultan passed, something in Fatima's family line snapped. Her father moved them to Jeddah, enrolled her in an English medium school, and slowly, deliberately, they shed the markers of their Bedouin past. The dialect was not spoken at home. The poems were not recited. Her mother burned the old wool tent panels rather than keep them as relics. It was, in her father's words, time to join the modern world. But Fatima remembered. She carried the language in her bones like a secret inheritance, a dialect most Saudis her age had never heard outside of dusty television dramas. She never spoke it publicly. In London, it was useless anyway. She communicated in the clipped, serviceable English of an immigrant who had learned by necessity enough to navigate landlords and university enrollment forms. She was studying accounting at Birkbeck College by night, balancing debits and credits in a language that promised a future her grandmother's tongue could not provide. In the dining room, the party of five settled at table 7, the prime corner booth that offered a view of the entire restaurant and a certain protection against surprise. The host was immediately recognizable as the man who would pay. He was in his mid-40s, barrel-chested, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit with a platinum watch that caught the light with every gesture. His name, Fatima would later learn, was Tariq al-Mansouri, the founder of a logistics empire that moved container ships across 3 continents. He had the confidence of a man who had never been told no and never expected to be. Beside him sat his mother. She was wrapped in a black abaya so simple it seemed almost defiant among the silk and sequins of the other guests. Her face was deeply lined, each crease a chapter of sun and wind. Her hands, resting on the tablecloth, were the hands of a woman who had worked, not the manicured, jeweled appendages of the other diners, but hands that had gathered wool and kneaded dough and held crying children through long nights. She said nothing as her son and his 3 associates debated the merits of a potential acquisition. Tariq ordered for her without asking, pointing at the menu while speaking to the waiter in rapid English. He chose the mildest dish, the least adventurous option, as if his mother's palate could not be trusted to handle complexity. The old woman watched his finger move across the page and lowered her eyes. Fatima was serving the adjacent table when she heard it. The associates were laughing at something Tariq had said about his mother, a joke delivered in that particular tone of cruel affection that rich sons reserve for the parents they are secretly ashamed of. And then louder, as if for the benefit of the whole restaurant, he waved his hand dismissively and declared, "My mother speaks no English. She's just a simple Bedouin woman from the desert. Don't bother with her." The old woman understood the dismissive gesture, if not the words. Her shoulders curled inward. She had crossed a desert once on foot, had buried 2 husbands and 3 children, had held her family together through decades of transformation. And now, in a London restaurant, her son had reduced her to an embarrassment. Fatima's heart hammered. She recognized that posture, that silent swallowing of shame. She had seen it in her own grandmother's eyes the day a Jeddah shopkeeper had mocked her traditional face covering. She had felt it herself, in 1,000 small slights that told her she did not belong in this city of glass and ambition. And then, from somewhere deep in her memory, her grandmother's voice returned. Not a whisper, but a command. The old dialect rose up in Fatima's throat like water from an ancient well, unstoppable and pure. She knew in that moment that she was about to break every rule of the invisible waitress. But before she opened her mouth, she would have to silence the voice that told her to stay quiet, to know her place, to survive another night. And that battle, in the seconds it lasted, was the hardest she had ever fought. She spoke, not in the polished, borrowed English she wore like a borrowed coat, but in the dialect that had been steeped in her grandmother's stories, in the cadences of tense that had weathered 1,000 sandstorms. Leaning close to the elderly woman's ear, Fatima murmured, "Ya Siti, Shu Bidik Takli," the pure Bedouin inflection stretching the vowels into a melody that no textbook had ever preserved. It was not modern Gulf Arabic, not the crisp, business-class dialect her son weaponized. It was the language of star maps and camel trails, of women who sang their children to sleep while empires crumbled in distant cities. The old woman's head lifted. Her eyes, which had been dull with resignation an instant earlier, sparked with something close to disbelief. She turned fully toward Fatima, her mouth opening slightly, and then she answered in the same ancient tongue. "Binti, inti min wen, min I Kabila, my daughter, where are you from? Which tribe?" The questions tumbled out, not as an interrogation, but as a homecoming. For the first time since she had entered that restaurant, she was no longer a burden at the table. She was a woman of lineage, of value, of voice. The effect on the son was instantaneous. Tariq al-Mansouri froze with a forkful of lamb halfway to his lips. His 3 associates, a British property developer, a Swiss investment banker, and a Kuwaiti marketing executive, exchanged confused glances. The banker, who had been laughing along with the joke about the simple Bedouin, now sensed that the architecture of the joke had collapsed. Tariq's face cycled from irritation to unease and finally to a bewildered vulnerability he had not worn in decades. His mother, the silent accessory to his cosmopolitan performance, was suddenly speaking a language he barely understood. And worse, she was speaking it with the confidence of a matriarch holding court. Fatima did not retreat. She answered the old woman's questions, telling her about her grandmother Sultan, about the poetry she had memorized, about the village near Tabuk, where the dialect still breathed in the lungs of the very old. The mother's name, Fatima learned, was Noura bint Fahad al-Utaybai, and she had been born in a black goat hair tent in the Nafar desert during a year of locusts and drought. Her father had been a Hakawati, a storyteller who could recite the entire epic of Anta for 7 consecutive nights without repeating a verse. She had married at 16, buried her first child at 17, and raised 5 more while her husband, Tariq's father, built a construction empire from a single bulldozer. And in all those years, through all that struggle, she had never stopped composing her own verses in the dialect of her ancestors, even when her son begged her to speak only English in front of his friends. "My son is ashamed of me," Nura said flatly, not as a plea for pity, but as a statement of fact. Fatima reached out and took her hand. The physical touch, across the invisible barbed wire of class and station, was its own quiet rebellion. Tariq slammed his fork down. "Enough," he snapped in English, his voice pitched for the table and the surrounding diners. "You are serving staff. You do not sit with my mother. You do not touch her. You bring the food and you leave." The manager, a nervous Cypriot named Andreas, was already threading through the tables toward the commotion. The whole dining room had gone quiet, the clinking of cutlery replaced by the low hum of withheld breath. But Fatima did not let go. "Your mother is a poet," she said, now in English so Tariq could not hide behind linguistic immunity. "She memorized 200 verses of pre-Islamic poetry. She knows the names of 87 desert plants and their medicinal uses. She is the last living speaker who can distinguish between the 7 different words for rain in her dialect, and you introduced her as a simple woman who speaks no English." The silence that followed was heavier than any insult. Tariq's associates stared at their plates. The Kuwaiti, whose own grandmother still used Bedouin proverbs, looked mortified. Nura, meanwhile, straightened her back and began to recite something softly in the dialect. Her voice, thin but steady, wove a poem about a falcon who refused the jesses of a wealthy hunter, choosing the open sky over a gilded cage. It was an old poem, one that her father had taught her when she could barely walk, and its message was unmistakable. Andreas reached the table and placed a firm hand on Fatima's elbow. "Kitchen, now." His accent was thick, his eyes panicked. The restaurant's reputation, its wealthy Gulf patronage, was a fragile ecosystem. Waitresses did not shame billionaires. Fatima rose, her legs trembling, and walked toward the service door. As she passed the other diners, a white-haired woman in a silk headscarf reached out and touched her arm. "Bless you," she whispered in Arabic, and Fatima burst into tears. She stood in the service corridor, her back against the cold tiled wall, waiting for the axe. Andreas would fire her, of course he would. She would be blacklisted from every high-end catering company in London. The accounting degree, the careful climb, the money she sent home to her sister in Jeddah who was trying to escape a bad marriage, all of it undone by 30 seconds of decency. Her phone buzzed. A text from her flatmate. "Is that you on Twitter?" Her stomach dropped. In the dining room, an influencer named Layla Shohri had been seated 10 feet from table 7, filming a review of the saffron panna cotta for her 400,000 followers. When she heard the commotion, she turned her camera. She captured Fatima leaning toward Nura, the 2 women speaking in that impossible dialect, and Tariq's face as the insult collapsed around him. She captured Nura's poem, The Falcon and the Hunter, with a trembling close-up of the old woman's hands moving in the same gestures her ancestors had used for millennia. Layla posted the raw footage with a caption that read, "A waitress just spoke a dying Bedouin dialect to a shamed mother, and the son's reaction will break you. This is cultural preservation in real time." By midnight, the video had 2 million views. By morning, 8 million. The hashtag Poet in the Abaya trended in 7 countries. Arabic-language news sites from Cairo to Dubai ran op-eds dissecting the clip frame by frame. Linguists from SOAS and the University of Vienna's WIBAIB project, researchers who had spent years documenting vanishing dialects, saw the footage and immediately tried to identify the precise linguistic markers of Nura's speech. One postdoctoral scholar tweeted, "The dialect spoken here exhibits a phonemic glottalized lateral fricative that was thought extinct since 2003. This is a Rosetta Stone moment." Tariq Al-Mansouri's corporate communications team was less celebratory. His company, Mansouri Global Logistics, was on the verge of signing a $2 billion infrastructure deal with a Norwegian sovereign wealth fund that had recently adopted stringent ethical and cultural heritage standards. Fund's board included a former UNESCO director. Within hours of the video going viral, a journalist at the Financial Times emailed the fund's press office asking whether they were comfortable partnering with an executive who had publicly denigrated his own mother's indigenous heritage. The deal, which had been 15 months in the making, suddenly wobbled. And in his penthouse overlooking Hyde Park, Tarek sat alone, staring at his phone as clips of his worst moment multiplied beneath his name. His mother, who had always been the silent anchor of his life, had become a symbol of resistance without ever intending to. She was still in her hotel suite, unaware of the digital firestorm swirling around her. But she knew something had shifted. When Tarek had tried to apologize in the car, fumbling for words in the sterile, affectionate Arabic he used with her, she had simply looked out the window and said, "That girl spoke the language your grandfather was beaten for using in school. You should be proud. Instead, you are embarrassed. That is not my shame to carry anymore." Fatima, meanwhile, woke the next morning to a suspended work schedule and a voicemail from a producer at the BBC World Service. Andreas had not fired her, not yet, but the restaurant had been flooded with threats and praise in equal measure. Conservative patrons accused her of humiliating a guest. Others demanded she be given a raise. Her face was everywhere, her name unknown, until a fellow waitress leaked it to a tabloid. Fatima Hassan, 28 and undocumented. No, she had a student visa, but now her name was public. The major pivot arrived on the second day. A professor of endangered languages at SOAS, Dr. Eliza Harding, watched the video 17 times and then called a colleague at the Royal Anthropological Institute. She explained that the poem Noura recited had never been transcribed. It was an oral artifact, a piece of the world's intangible heritage, preserved by accident in the memory of a woman who could neither read nor write. If the poem was recorded and analyzed, it could reshape scholarly understanding of Najdi poetic forms. But time was against them. Noura was 92, her heart was frail, and her son, shielding her from what he saw as scandal, was refusing all interview requests, all academic access, all public appearances. He had effectively locked a living library behind a wall of shame. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, a billionaire trying to extinguish the fire to save his empire. On the other, a waitress, a poet, and a team of linguists who saw in a restaurant confrontation nothing less than a last chance to save a dying voice. And the next move, the one that would force Tariq al-Mansouri to face everything he had tried to erase, would come not from the boardroom or the courtroom, but from a dusty apartment in East London where Fatima Hassan opened her door to a stranger carrying an impossible proposal. The woman at the door was not what Fatima expected. She was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a rumpled linen jacket that suggested she prioritized ideas over ironing. A leather satchel hung across her chest, stuffed with notebooks and recording equipment. She introduced herself as Dr. Eliza Harding, professor of endangered languages at SOAS, and she had been searching for Noura bint Fahad al-Utaybi for 7 years. The video had given her the first solid lead. She needed Fatima's help to convince Noura to record her poetry, to capture the dialect before it vanished entirely. In exchange, she offered Fatima a research stipend, a legitimate university affiliation that would protect her visa status, and a chance to honor her own grandmother's legacy. Fatima's hand trembled on the doorframe. This was not a lifeline, it was a rocket. But Tariq al-Mansouri had already drawn first blood. By the time Fatima sat down with Dr. Harding at her cramped kitchen table, a courier had delivered a thick envelope from a law firm with offices in the Shard. The letter accused Fatima of defamation, breach of hospitality, and violating data protection laws by engaging with a guest's companion without consent. It demanded a public apology, the deletion of all related social media posts, and a written undertaking never to contact Noura al-Utaybi again. If she failed to comply within 72 hours, they would pursue damages in the High Court and alert the Home Office to what they called irregularities in her immigration conduct. Fatima read the letter 3 times, the legal jargon blurring into white noise. The threat to her visa was the kill shot. She was a student on a Tier 4 visa, allowed to work 20 hours per week during term time. Al-Maha's payroll had never been meticulous about tracking shifts. She had often worked 30 hours or more to cover rent and tuition. If Tariq's lawyers made a formal complaint, she could be detained, deported, and barred from the UK for 10 years. All because she had spoken her grandmother's language to a woman who needed to hear it. Dr. Harding did not flinch. She had spent 30 years in conflict zones, documenting languages while governments crumbled around her. She slid a document across the table. It was a formal offer of a visiting research fellowship, citing Fatima, rare and valuable linguistic competency in a critically endangered dialect, as grounds for expedited endorsement. The university's legal team, alerted by Harding the night before, was ready to intervene with immigration authorities. The stipend was modest but legal. It wouldn't erase the fear, but it gave Fatima a shield. She signed on the dotted line, her hands still shaking, and the battle lines were redrawn. The next move came from Tariq's PR team. Anonymous accounts on social media began seeding a counter-narrative. Fatima was a disgruntled employee who had fabricated a viral moment to monetize her victimhood. She was an illegal immigrant exploiting a kindly old woman for clout. She was, as one particularly vicious post put it, a gold digger in a polyester uniform. The posts gained traction in the darker corners of the British tabloid ecosystem. A columnist at a right-wing paper wrote a piece headlined "Waitress or Wolf in Sheep's Clothing," questioning how a student on a visa could afford London rent and suggesting she was part of a larger scam. That morning, Fatima received a dozen rape threats and a photograph of her grandmother's grave with a red X drawn over it. But the counter-narrative had a fatal flaw. Layla Shohri, the influencer whose footage had launched the viral firestorm, had continued filming after her initial post. She had hours of raw footage from that night, including Tariq's dismissive gesture, the exact moment he called his mother a simple Bedouin, and the first lines of Noura's poem about the falcon. Layla released the extended cut, time-stamped and unedited. The clip showed that Fatima had not initiated the conversation. She had responded after Noura spoke to her. It showed the manager, Andreas, yanking Fatima away while Tariq's mother reached for her hand. The narrative flipped. Tariq's attempt to smear Fatima only amplified the footage of his own cruelty. The hashtag Justice for Fatima trended alongside Poet in the Abaya. Then came the revelation that changed everything. Dr. Harding's team, digging into the Alutebei tribe's history to contextualize Noura's dialect, discovered a buried connection that made the entire saga look less like a family squabble and more like an intergenerational reckoning with dispossession. Tariq's father, Faisal al-Mansouri, had built his construction fortune in the 1970s and 80s on government contracts that involved clearing so-called informal settlements around expanding Saudi cities. Many of those settlements were Bedouin encampments, the winter camps of tribes like the Alutebei, who had used the land for centuries. Faisal's first major contract, the one that paid for the family's move to Jeddah and launched their empire, was the clearance of an area called Wadi al-Dawasir, where Noura's family had grazed their goats since before the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The bulldozers arrived while Noura was pregnant with her second child. Her father, the Hakawati who knew 100,000 lines of poetry, died of a heart attack the day his tent was flattened. Faisal al-Mansouri had literally destroyed his wife's ancestral home to build a shopping complex. Noura had buried that grief beneath decades of silence, but it lived in her poetry. One of the verses she had started reciting at the restaurant, which Dr. Harding's team had transcribed from Layla's extended footage, contained the line, "The iron beast ate my father's tent, and I married the man who fed it." The scholars who analyzed the text could barely believe what they were reading. Noura had been composing elegies for her erased world while living in the household of the man who had profited from that erasure. And her son, raised in the privilege of that profit, had grown up to mock the very heritage his father had bulldozed. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund's Ethics Committee received the translated poem along with a dossier from the Royal Anthropological Institute. Within 6 hours, the fund's chairperson, a former UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Rights, released a statement. "We are pausing all negotiations with Mansouri Global Logistics pending a full review of the company's historical land acquisition practices and their alignment with our cultural heritage protection standards." $2 billion hung by a thread, woven from a 92-year-old woman's memory. Tariq was summoned to an emergency board meeting in Riyadh. His younger brother, Khalid, who had always been the gentler son, flew in from Dubai and confronted him in the executive suite. "You turned our mother into a liability," Khalid said, his voice tight. "You insulted her in public, you tried to destroy the one person who showed her respect, and now you've put the entire company in jeopardy because you couldn't bear the sound of your own grandfather's language." The argument escalated until security was called to separate them. The board, witnessing the family unraveling, began to murmur about succession. Tariq's position as CEO, once untouchable, was now a week-by-week proposition. Meanwhile, Fatima and Noura were meeting in secret. Dr. Harding had arranged a private suite at a university-owned townhouse in Bloomsbury, away from the press and Tariq's lawyers. There, over cups of cardamom coffee brewed the old way, Noura began to speak. Not just the poems, but the stories behind them. The day the bulldozers came, the sight of her father's body being carried from the wreckage, the terrible bargain of marrying Faisal, a man who promised to provide for her family if she would only stop speaking about what had been lost. She had not stopped composing, but she had hidden the verses like contraband, reciting them only to the youngest children when no one else was listening. Now, with Fatima holding the recorder, she let them flow. One recording session lasted 7 hours. Noura recited 43 poems, each one a window into a world that no longer existed. The smell of rain on desert sand, the constellation names her father taught her, the medicinal properties of a plant called she that only grew where camels had watered. She spoke the dialect with a precision that brought Dr. Harding to tears. The glottalized lateral fricative, the phoneme that linguists had declared extinct, appeared in 17 separate words. It was the linguistic equivalent of finding a living dinosaur. But Tariq found out. A junior assistant in the university's anthropology department, hopping to curry favor with a potential donor, tipped off Mansouri Global's London office. Tariq dispatched a crisis team, lawyers, a private security detail, and a physician who was prepared to declare Noura mentally unfit to make her own decisions. They arrived at the Bloomsbury townhouse during a recording session. The lead lawyer, a silver-haired man in a £5,000 suit, demanded that Harding surrender all recordings and that Fatima be removed from the premises or face arrest for elder abuse and undue influence. The physician approached Noura with a patronizing smile and asked her, in English, to state her name and the current year. Noura looked at her son's hired physician, then at the lawyer, then at Fatima. And she began to speak, not in English, but in the pure Bedouin dialect she had carried across a century. "My name is Noura bint Fahad Al-Utaybai," she said, with Harding translating in real time. "I am 92 years old. I have survived locusts, drought, the death of 4 children, and the destruction of my people's land. You think a man with a medical degree and a smile full of lies can tell me who I am?" She stood, a tiny figure in black, and pointed a trembling finger at the lawyer. "My son sent you because he is afraid, not of you, not of me, but of the truth that I carry. Go back and tell him that his mother is not his property. She never was." The lawyer, momentarily stunned, tried a different tack. He produced a court order, rushed through a sympathetic judge in the early hours of the morning, granting Tariq temporary guardianship over his mother's welfare. The order cited concerns that Noura was being manipulated by unknown persons for financial and political gain. It authorized Tariq to remove his mother from the premises and to prohibit any further contact with Fatima Hassan or any representative of SOAS. Harding argued, but the order was stamped and signed. The security detail moved forward to take Noura's arm. This was the moment that would define everything that followed. Not the restaurant, not the viral video, but this quiet room in Bloomsbury where an empire's machinery met an old woman's dignity. Fatima stepped between Noura and the security guards. She had no legal standing, no resources, no plan. What she had was the certainty that if Noura was taken now, the poems would be erased again and the world would lose a voice that had survived every attempt to silence it. She had her phone, and she had one call she could make, not to the police, but to Layla Shohri, whose millions of followers were waiting for the next chapter of a story that had already captured the world's conscience. The live stream would start in seconds. The billionaire's son was about to learn that some witnesses you cannot intimidate and some mothers you cannot own. and Fatima Hassan, the invisible waitress, was about to become the custodian of a legacy that would shake foundations from London to Riyadh. Layla Shohri arrived in 7 minutes, her phone already broadcasting. She had been editing footage in a cafe 3 blocks away when Fatima's message came through. "They're taking her, Bloomsbury, now." The live stream flickered to life as Layla pushed through the crowd gathering outside the townhouse. She held the camera up, framing the Georgian door, the black SUV idling at the curb, and the small figure of Fatima Hassan standing between 2 beefy security guards and an elderly woman wrapped in black. The caption Layla typed was simple: "A billionaire is trying to silence his mother's poetry. We are live from London." The effect was instantaneous. Within 90 seconds, 300,000 people were watching. Within 5 minutes, that number crossed 2 million. Comments in Arabic, English, French, Turkish flooded the feed. Someone in Riyadh recognized the building. Someone else in Dubai tagged the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund's official account. The digital mob that had once threatened to destroy Fatima now swelled in her defense. And the security guards, trained to manage physical threats, had no protocol for a global audience watching their every move. The silver-haired lawyer felt his phone vibrate, then vibrate again, then begin a continuous seizure of notifications. Mansory Global's communications director was screaming at him through text messages. The live stream had reached the financial press. Bloomberg was already running a headline: "Mansory Air caught trying to seize elderly poet mother." The lawyer looked at Noura, still standing with her chin raised, and at the physician whose patronizing smile had curdled into panic. He made a calculation. The court order, signed in haste by a judge who hadn't seen a viral video at 3 in the morning, would not survive 10 minutes of public scrutiny. He told the security detail to stand down. Tariq al-Mansouri, watching from his penthouse across the city, hurled a crystal decanter at the wall. He had lost. Not to a waitress, not to a university professor, but to the truth his father had bulldozed and his mother had hidden in her heart for 70 years. The Norwegian fund withdrew from negotiations completely within 48 hours, citing irreparable reputational damage. 2 other sovereign investors followed. Mansory Global's stock price dropped 22% in a single trading day. The board, already fractured, voted to remove Tariq as CEO, appointing his younger brother Khalid as interim chairman. Tariq was offered a severance package large enough to disappear, and he took it, retreating to a villa in Monaco where the only people he could humiliate were paid to tolerate him. But the real resolution was not Tariq's downfall. It was Noura's liberation. With the legal threats neutralized and the world watching, Noura agreed to a full recording project. Dr. Harding's team, funded by an emergency grant from UNESCO and a flood of private donations, set up a professional recording studio in the Bloomsbury townhouse. For 3 weeks, Noura spoke. She recited not 43 poems, but 117. She narrated the names of plants, the migration patterns of birds, the wedding songs and funeral laments of a people who had once roamed from the Nafad to the empty quarter. She told the story of her father, the Hakawati, whose epic recitations had lasted 7 nights. She cried only once, when she recited the poem about the falcon and the hunter, the same one that had silenced the restaurant and launched a revolution. Fatima sat beside her for every session. The young woman, who had once hidden her heritage for survival, now found herself as a research partner at a major university, her stipend ensuring she could complete her accounting degree without terror. Her sister in Jeddah, finally free of the abusive marriage, moved to London and enrolled in an English course. The money from the viral videos, carefully managed by a pro bono solicitor, was channeled into a foundation of Fatima's own creation, the Sultan Bedouin Oral Heritage Trust, named after her grandmother, dedicated to recording and preserving the endangered dialects of the Arabian Peninsula's nomadic peoples before the last speakers passed away. The surprising detail came on the final day of recording. Dr. Harding's archivists, cross-referencing Noura's plant names with historical records, discovered that one of the medicinal herbs she described, a desert shrub called Garda that her grandmother had used to treat infections, contained compounds that modern pharmacology had only recently begun to study for antibiotic-resistant bacteria. A team at Imperial College London requested samples. The plant, which grew only in a remote valley that Nura's tribe had once inhabited, might hold keys to a medical breakthrough. The woman Tariq had called Simple had carried, in her memory, a pharmacopoeia that could save lives a century after her birth. When the recordings were complete, a ceremony was held at the British Library. Nura, dressed in her finest abaya, sat on a small chair while dignitaries from UNESCO, the Saudi Ministry of Culture, and the University of London rose to praise her. The recordings would be housed in the library's permanent collection, the first comprehensive oral archive of a NATIVE Bedouin dialect ever to be preserved and catalogued. Fatima introduced her, not as a server, but as a colleague, a cultural guardian, and a friend. Nura, her voice now amplified by a microphone, recited a final poem. It was a blessing for the young, a call to remember the old words even as the world changed around them. The audience, many of whom had seen the original video on their phones, wept without shame. 2 months later, Khalid Al-Mansouri, now in control of the family conglomerate, issued a formal apology on behalf of the company. He announced a $100 million endowment for indigenous language preservation across the Arab world, administered in partnership with SOAS and the Sultan Trust. He visited his mother in London, not as a CEO but as a son, and sat with her for an hour while she spoke in the dialect he had never learned. He began taking lessons, awkwardly stumbling through the sounds his father had forbidden, determined that his own children would know the tongue of their ancestors. It was, he said, the least he could do to honor the woman who had held his family together through every storm. Fatima Hassan graduated from Birkbeck with first-class honors 18 months after the restaurant incident. She wore her cap and gown with the same quiet pride she had once carried beneath a polyester uniform. The photograph of her grandmother, Sultan, was tucked into the pocket of her robe. She now directed the trust full-time, traveling to Oman, Jordan, and Sudan to document speakers whose language communities numbered in the dozens. Her story had become a symbol, but she remained what she had always been, a woman who refused to let dignity be silenced. And Nura bint Fahad Al-Utaybi lived 5 more years, long enough to see her great-grandchildren speak their first words in the dialect she had preserved. When she passed, at 97, her funeral was attended by linguists, diplomats, and tribal elders who had crossed continents to honor the last great poet of the Nafad. But the legacy she left was not in the eulogies or the archives. It lived in every young girl who heard the story and realized that the language others mocked might one day become the language of liberation. It lived in the laughter of children learning to roll the glottalized lateral fricative off their tongues, a sound once declared extinct and now reborn. And it lived in Fatima, who walked forward into a future she had never imagined, carrying the voices of her ancestors like a torch that no billionaire's shame could ever extinguish. The story of Fatima and Nura is not just about one confrontation in a London restaurant. It is about what happens when a culture becomes ashamed of itself and what it costs to reclaim that pride. Across the world, a language dies every 2 weeks, not with a thunderclap, but in the quiet moment when a grandmother stops speaking to her grandchildren because she has been made to feel that her words are backward, primitive, and unwanted. What happened at Table 7 was a microcosm of a global crisis, one that has nothing to do with vocabulary and everything to do with identity. Tariq Al-Mansouri was not a villain in the cartoonish sense. He was a man who learned, early and repeatedly, that success meant shedding the skin of his origins. His father bulldozed the past to build the future. His schools rewarded English and punished Arabic dialects. His social circles equated Bedouin heritage with backwardness, and he absorbed that lesson so thoroughly that he could not hear poetry when his own mother spoke it. In his shame, he was utterly ordinary. Millions of people across the world carry the same wound, silencing the voices of their elders not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to belong to a modernity that demands they forget. But what Fatima did, stepping forward not with wealth or credentials, but with the simple act of recognition, proved that the machinery of erasure can be jammed by a single moment of courage. She did not plan a revolution. She did not calculate the optics. She heard a woman being diminished, and she answered in the language of that woman's heart. That is not just kindness. That is cultural preservation in its most intimate and powerful form. Nura's poems are now stored in the British Library, accessible to scholars and descendants for as long as those institutions endure. But the real victory is not in the archive. It is in the thousands of young people who saw the video and called their grandmothers to ask, "What language did your mother speak? Teach me a word." It is in the classrooms across the Middle East where students have begun demanding that their heritage dialects be studied alongside modern standard Arabic and English. It is in the quiet shift of conscience that turns shame into curiosity and curiosity into pride. The question that lingers is not whether this story had a happy ending, but whether we will recognize our own table 7 moments when they arrive. Every family carries a Nura somewhere, an elder whose accent is thick, whose references are old, whose presence can feel inconvenient in polished company. The choice to listen or to dismiss is a choice that echoes far beyond the dinner table. It decides what knowledge survives and what wisdom dies with the last speaker who carries it. If this story moved you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss a story about the hidden heroes walking among us. Drop a comment below. What language did your grandparents speak that you wish you had learned? Let us know where in the world you are watching from. Your voice belongs here, just as every voice belongs to the story of humanity. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.